Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a significant effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to talk about General Norman Schwarzkopf, who died recently at the age of 78. General Schwarzkopf was the most important American general of the post-Vietnam War era. He was the commander-in-chief of coalition forces in the Persian Gulf War, which was the last major conflict of the 20th century. He was the operational leader of Operation Desert Storm, which liberated Kuwait from Iraqi forces of Saddam Hussein in 1991. Here is a West Point documentary on the life of General Schwarzkopf. It says his father was an Army officer, which is true, but he was also the superintendent of New Jersey police, who investigated the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's infant son in the early 1930s that resulted in the arrest and execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann. That happens to be my favorite bit of Norman Schwarzkopf trivia.
Herbert Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. was born in 1934 in New Jersey, the son of an Army officer. At age 18, he attended West Point, where he became an excellent scholar and athlete. Schwarzkopf graduated in 1956 and was commissioned into the elite 101st Airborne Division, making his mark as an outstanding young officer. After gaining a master's degree in mechanical engineering, he became an instructor at West Point. Schwarzkopf then volunteered for service in Vietnam, where he completed 2 tours of duty between 1965 and 1971. He gained invaluable combat experience both as an advisor to the Vietnamese and as a battalion commander. He was also decorated for his courage and leadership. Schwarzkopf then served in command and general staff appointments with NATO forces in Europe and the States in the 70s. In 1983, Major General Schwarzkopf was chosen to lead the U.S. ground forces in the invasion of Grenada, codenamed Operation Urgent Fury. In 1988, he was sent to head U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM. For the next 2 years, he drew up contingencies to deal with possible threats to the Middle East. General Schwarzkopf soon convinced President George Bush that CENTCOM was the most qualified headquarters to lead the coalition forces in the Gulf.
Before we get to Desert Storm, I want to make 2 points. Schwarzkopf said late in life that if you'd asked him in 1956 where he would be serving during his life, he didn't know what he would say, but he knew he wouldn't say Vietnam, Grenada, and Iraq. So you never can tell how that's going to turn out. The second thing is, at the end of his life, he was very critical of William Westmoreland, who was the supreme commander of the American troops in Vietnam. And I think that shaped a lot of his philosophy. I think in some ways he tried to be the anti-Westmoreland in his approach to warfare, in terms of rapid warfare and minimizing American casualties. On to Desert Storm. Here's a documentary report on the origins of the Persian Gulf War, where Schwarzkopf would have his major role.
The official ending of the Cold War between the Eastern and Western blocs in July 1990 significantly reduced world tension. The threat of nuclear war, which had existed for 40 years, receded, and a new, more stable global order appeared to be on the horizon. However, less than 1 month later, Saddam Hussein would severely test this new world order's ability to police itself. On August 2nd, his army invaded Iraq's small but oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. Within 24 hours, Iraq overwhelmed Kuwaiti resistance and secured the capital of Kuwait City. Although Iraqi forces had been amassing near the Kuwaiti border, the attack took the international community by surprise. Saddam Hussein announced that the invasion was vital because Kuwait had refused to renegotiate a huge loan made to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. He also explained that high Kuwaiti oil production was keeping prices too low, and that the Kuwaitis were drilling in a disputed oil field on the border with Iraq. Yet only hours before the attack, Saddam had publicly assured his fellow Arab leader, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, who had been mediating in these disputes, that he would not use force. It was a calculated lie. As Saddam visited his victorious troops in Kuwaiti territory on August 3rd, a potentially devastating international crisis loomed. The United Nations Security Council met within days of the Iraqi invasion. It condemned this act of aggression and demanded an immediate withdrawal. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker and Russian Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze issued a joint attack on Iraq. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and U.S. President George Bush agreed that the UN must be prepared to use military force against Iraq. Surveillance satellites showed that the Iraqis were now gathering on Kuwait's border with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi people, despite living in an outwardly opulent Western-style society, are deeply religious and hesitated to allow non-Muslim forces into their country. But the threat from Iraq convinced them otherwise. On August 6th, the Arab League voted to deploy their troops to protect Saudi Arabia. 2 days later, the first U.S. troops, the 82nd Airborne Division, arrived. The initial coalition force defense of Saudi Arabia was codenamed Operation Desert Shield. General Norman Schwarzkopf was appointed as the overall commander of the coalition. At the time, he was head of U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, which already had contingency plans to deal with problems in the Middle East. The coalition ground forces in Saudi Arabia were soon supported by American and British combat aircraft, which would patrol Saudi airspace. By the evening of January 16, 1991, the waiting and speculation for both sides was almost over. Both General Norman Schwarzkopf and President Saddam Hussein were convinced that victory would be theirs. Early on the morning of January 17, 1991, General Schwarzkopf opened Operation Desert Storm by launching F-117A stealth fighter bombers on missions over Iraq. Their initial targets were Iraqi Air Defense Command, Control, and Communications Centers.
This was the first televised war, and in fact something interesting happened. The first bombing of Baghdad was picked up by CNN before the Americans had announced what was going on. So General Colin Powell and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney were caught flat-footed when CNN announced the bombing, before the government announced it.
About 10 or 15 minutes ago, just before we heard all these explosions. Right now, a big portion of the city, the portion where we are, has been blacked out. We've lost electricity. Now off to the south of our position, we can see some more tracer rounds going up into the sky over some of the main downtown Baghdad buildings in the direction, generally, Peter, of the presidential palace.
It is in the direction of the presidential palace, but the palace is barely a mile from here, as are the main communication centers, and the bombing has not come in this far yet. The attack did begin about 2:30 a.m. our time. The skies are clear. There's stars, but the city was deathly quiet all day. Traffic has been dwindling, and shops were closed, and people have been moving out. Now, here in the hotel, the Al Rashid Hotel where we are, there was some indication. Earlier this evening, some of our colleagues received calls from friends who said tonight may be the night, Peter, for the multinational force to begin its strike, threatened strike against Iraq, and tonight it has come, John.
That's right, Peter.
Powell and Cheney hemmed and hawed in front of the TV cameras for a little while, and the next morning George H.W. Bush came on to announce it.
What we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Once again, this was a decision made only after extensive consultations within our coalition partnership. The liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission.
Well, at Desert Storm, Schwarzkopf had over 500,000 troops and the largest multinational task force since the Korean War, and he had 2 charges.
And today, General Norman Schwarzkopf revealed that finishing the Republican Guards in Iraq was as much a mission as liberating Kuwait.
If I'm to accomplish the mission that I was given, and that's to make sure that the Republican Guard is rendered incapable of conducting the type of heinous act that they've conducted so often in the past, what has to be done is these forces continue to attack across here and put the Republican Guard out of business.
Schwarzkopf had an interesting comment about Saddam Hussein that I think later came back to bedevil him to a certain extent.
Saddam Hussein is not a military man. He thought of this war in tactical terms, okay, at the lowest level. He never thought of it in strategic terms. And what's happening is all of a sudden he's finding that he's taken a terrible licking strategically, and he has no capability to react to that. I don't think we're close to breaking Saddam's will. I don't think that that's breakable. But I certainly think that we have a capability of breaking the will of his military, and I think we're making great progress in that direction from all the reports we get.
Schwarzkopf did a wonderful job of breaking the Republican Guard's will and liberating Kuwait. He did it quickly. The actual ground war was 100 hours, and he did it with low American casualties. The strategy was primarily a frontal assault, which Saddam anticipated, with a flanking maneuver to the north, which Saddam did not anticipate, combined with a feint of an amphibious operation, which Saddam expected that never came. The Allies' superiority in manpower, weaponry, and air cover made short work of the Iraqi divisions.
Where we are today is we now have a solid wall across the north of the 18th Airborne Corps, consisting of the units shown right here, attacking straight to the east. We have a solid wall here again of the 7th Corps, also attacking straight to the east. The forces that they are fighting right now are the forces of the Republican Guard.
Officials said the American losses are remarkably light. At day's end, 23 Americans had died in the air war, 28 in ground combat, 28 from a Scud missile attack, including 2 women, for a total of 79 dead, and 53 missing or captured.
Besides being the first widely televised war, the Persian Gulf War was also one of the first times that environmental warfare was attempted when Saddam Hussein lit oil wells on fire, but it pretty much backfired on him.
One Pentagon officer said the oily fires set by Iraqis had backfired on them. Thermal gun sights on U.S. tanks worked flawlessly, but the hazy, oily skies blinded the Iraqi tank crews.
We've had several anecdotal reports today of enemy who were saying to us that they couldn't see anything through their sights, and all of a sudden their tank exploded when their tank was hit by our sight.
But the splendid little war did trip up Schwarzkopf to a certain extent. The tactics worked, but the strategy wasn't as successful as he anticipated. The same thing that he claimed about Saddam Hussein. And Schwarzkopf has to come in for at least a little criticism for this. Here he talks about what they could have accomplished in a press conference.
In an extraordinary briefing that gave the world, including Saddam, the first look at how the Iraqi army had been routed, Schwarzkopf crowed about U.S. forces like the 101st Airborne landing deep in Iraq and how he could have taken Baghdad.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we were here, we were 150 miles away from Baghdad, and there was nobody between us and Baghdad. If it had been our intention to take Iraq, if it had been our intention to destroy the country, if it had been our intention to overrun the country, we could have done it unopposed for all intents and purposes from this position at that time.
The problem is Saddam was routed. He knew he was routed. Schwarzkopf may have overestimated what he had done to the Iraqi army. And so, upon orders from the higher-ups, from Colin Powell, from Dick Cheney, and from the president, Schwarzkopf negotiated a surrender, but the surrender left much of the Revolutionary Guard in place, enough to keep Saddam in power. He also had enough helicopter gunships to maintain his hold on the country, to kill thousands of Kurds and Shiites, torture Iraqis, and threaten the world for another decade. In some respects, Schwarzkopf's victory was like the Allied victory in World War I, decisive but not definitive, in the sense that it merely forestalled another war and was the prelude to an even greater conflict later on. Here are Powell, Cheney, and Schwarzkopf talking about the decision to negotiate a surrender that left Saddam in power with enough military to rule over his country for another 10 years.
We'd asked the troops to do about all we could do by way of continuing the slaughter. I mean, in fact, the Iraqi resistance was collapsing fairly rapidly. And it was pretty clear that we'd won a tremendous victory.
Colin Powell called me. He said, I'm at the White House. We've discussed ending the war. Could you, in fact, execute a ceasefire if it was declared effective midnight Washington time tonight, which would have been first thing in the morning, our time? I told him that I could live with that.
And he said, yeah, I think that's probably a right thing to do, or words to that effect.
Quite frankly, the driving force behind my saying that I could live with it was the fact that if we went on another day, we were going to kill some more of our people, and we had already won an overwhelming victory with a minimum of casualties, and that was good enough for me. I was just damn glad to have the victory in our hands with a minimum loss of casualties, and I was willing to settle for that because that's a hell of a lot more than anybody's had in war in as long as I can remember.
You could be accused of second-guessing, but it was clearly a tactical victory, albeit not a strategic victory. And he may have had Vietnam in mind there, as his superiors might have. Some of his adjutants in the war room were not happy about it, especially when they had the Iraqi army encircled.
In the war room, there had been no thought of a ceasefire. After 6 months of planning, the next day would see the Iraqis trapped.
General Schwarzkopf walked into the war room, and he said, "We are going to have a ceasefire." Well, I thought that he was jesting. So I said, "That's bullshit." So he says, "No, I'm serious. We will have a ceasefire. So I said, we have not accomplished our mission. Why is it that we're going to stop what we set out to do and stop the war? And General Schwarzkopf says, Cal, God damn it, the President of the United States has made a decision to stop this war.
The questionable strategy could be blamed on Schwarzkopf's higher-ups, but you have to wonder how much they base their information and their decision on what Schwarzkopf provided to them. Schwarzkopf did a wonderful job in winning what he had to win, but in fairness, he may have overstated the American military position. He was lucky that Saddam was not pursuing atomic weapons at the time, and he may have overestimated the Iraqi fighting force while underestimating them as a security terror tool for Saddam. It's clear that the Iraqi army was not the formidable army that it was presented. It's clear that they were decimated from the Iran-Iraq war, that their weaponry and morale were not that good. With those caveats, Norman Schwarzkopf was one of our best second half of the 20th century generals. He may have fallen short of our best, but he was certainly good. Here's what he said to the graduates of West Point several years ago.
If you leave here with the word duty implanted in your mind, if you leave here with the word honor carved into your soul, if you leave here with love of country stamped on your heart, then you will be a 21st century leader, worthy, and I do mean worthy, of the great privilege and honor that you will have, whether it's at platoon level, company level, battalion level, brigade level, division level, corps level, or theater level. The great honor and privilege you will have of leading the magnificent young men and women who are the sons and daughters of America, who are the thunder and lightning of Desert Storm.
He was often asked to run for public office, but he eschewed it after the Persian Gulf War, and upon his retirement he gave a beautiful speech.
I gotta tell you, no matter how eloquent the orator, no matter how prolific the poet, no matter how lyrical the songwriter, no words can ever capture the emotions that go through a person's heart when he stands for the last time and hears the national anthem and salutes the American flag, representing the country that he has gladly, proudly served for the last 35 years.
Our country will forever be in your debt. Thank you for your service, General Schwarzkopf. We're going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. Before we close, we're going to do a brief segment on a rock and soul singer who died recently, Fontella Bass. She died recently at the age of 72. She was from St. Louis, but she moved up to Chicago where she recorded for Chess Records. In 1965, she had a huge hit, a million seller. It was #1 for Chess Records, and the Southside Studio hadn't had a #1 for almost a decade. In the 1950s, they recorded a couple #1s for Chuck Berry. It has the late, great Minnie Riperton on background vocals, and Fontella Bass will always be remembered for this great production of Rescue Me.